and we are live with episode 35 of the Wake Up podcast. And on this episode, I've got someone who many of you will know, Andrew Henderson on the call from Nomad Capitalist. Andrew, thank you for joining me. I know it's early where you are, and I appreciate you getting on the call, man.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Absolutely. So these days we're all busy, especially those of us in the quote unquote sovereignty parts of the business of life, especially with seeing how 2020 I think has sort of just been one of those watershed moments where people, I think, I've been called crazy for many years for trying to pursue either multiple residencies or passports or financial sovereignty and stuff like that. And the argument's always been, why would you need that? Everything's okay. And sort of this last 24 months, we've seen what I call like a retarded variation of the zombie apocalypse take over the world, where everyone's actually lost their minds and no one thinks about anything else. And the need for I guess approaching sovereignty in the world, or approaching sovereignty in your life in the context of the world has become ever more important. So I'd love to hear, before we get into any of the deeper topics, sort of what your past 12 months have been like, and whether the general opinion has changed, evolved, etc. for you.
Well, I've talked in the mid 90s. My father and I would have conversations. I was 12 years old. Go where you're treated best. If you want to be an entrepreneur, this probably won't be the place. The United States. It's been good. It's had a good run. Probably not going to continue. So who in 1995 or 1996 was saying like, you don't want to live in the United States? So it's, for me, been 25 years of this coming true. You're a good looking guy, social, like a lot of us here, we were never popular, so I wasn't really too concerned about whether people were liking my passports or not. It was, for me, the beginning of this go where you're treated best was a social approach where I realized other places there were people who understood my drive to have a business at 21 years old, more than people where I was living. So it has been crazy. It's been increasingly crazy. Now, obviously, the more that I go out there, I wrote a book, called Nomad Capitalist, which has done incredibly well over the last 3 years. We've been on BBC and Bloomberg and all over the place. So part of it, I suppose, is just more people who are, coming and finding Nomad Capitalist. But it does definitely seem like after kind of a month last year in March of 2020, people were kind of freaked out. And then they realized, no, we need to freak out. Like, this is, the government doesn't care about us. We need options. For the first time, people like Americans found that their passport was not really that good when it was stress tested. And it's been insane in terms of people coming and saying, I want a plan B. Not just people who are entrepreneurs or crypto guys who want to lower their taxes. That's the plan A. But it has been, I don't know what the growth is, hundreds of percent growth of people who want a plan B. They want a second passport. They want a back pocket residence permit. They want a plan that they can use because they've realized finally the veneer is coming off. And I guess I'll give people a little bit of credit that, people have said, well, I'll leave when things get bad enough. I think people are realizing, it will certainly get worse, I think, but this is pretty bad.
I think that there's a saying that I love, and I'm going to completely butcher it or paraphrase it here, but and I believe it's attributed to Julian Assange, but he talks about how, one of the most incredible attributes of human beings is our capacity or our ability to adapt to situations. But it's also one of our most dangerous attributes, is because we'll continually, like, it's the old Nazi prison guard situation, which is, the Nazi prison guards didn't start that way. They edged towards that step by step, and became that way. And that's sort of how, like, if you want to change societies, you start off with a 2-week flatten the curve promise, and 12 months later you're talking about vaccine fucking passports and multiple classes of society, and complete mandates on what you can and cannot do as a healthy individual based on what some central bureaucrat deems is the way we should all live. So it's I think what you just said there, like, it is really, really, really bad, but unfortunately, most people have sort of most people have kind of walked into the modern day house arrest slash.
Yeah, I mean, it's entrepreneurs, right? I mean, this is like, they've always been doing this. I mean, we complain about the government. Do you know who's even worse than the government sometimes? Is corporate bureaucrocy. You ever get on the plane? I used to fly with United all the time in the US. Now I fly with good airlines, so I don't have as much experience with this. But it used to be like, we're going to be 10 minutes late. And then 10 minutes later, we're still working on the problem, but and then like 10 minutes later, yeah, we're just gonna, we're gonna pack ourselves. And then like 3 hours later, yeah, it's all falling apart. We're gonna take you back to the gate and fly you tomorrow. And people love that, being dosed 5 minutes, 10 minutes at a time. They love it. As entrepreneurs, as investors, certainly we've been successful because we've adapted. But the older I get, I think I adapt less, and I look at things and I say, this doesn't work. And for me, that's what go where you're treated best is. I have so many people from the United States. I left the U.S. Close to a decade ago for good. I gave up my citizenship a number of years ago. I burned the bridge, as it were. And so many people, oh, you're a traitor. We have to stand up for our rights. Who's going to stand up? If not the United States, then where will that be? You're right. There's only 200 countries. If one fails, the rest will have no choice but to go with it. And I say, you know what? I'm sick of adapting. I know what I want. I know it's out there and it already exists. I'm just going to go there. I'm not going to try and recreate anything. I'm not going to try and change anyone's mind. I run a business. I've been hiring people to keep up with the demand like crazy. You know what? If you want to do things your way and that's not my way, that's totally cool. And there's no judgment, but you're not working for me. Even now with, clientele, listen, we do it a certain way. I want to make sure I'm working with people that get great results. If we're on the same page, that's cool. I don't want to take your money, right? And these are things that are very hard for people to understand. It's very hard for someone in the West to be like, wait a minute, business doesn't want to take my money. That's correct. And in many cases, it's not the right thing to do, or, whatever, we don't want to do it. And I think that at a certain point, I mean, you have to be adaptable. At a certain point, you also have to say, I'm going to stop adapting. I'm going to stop acknowledging this 5-minute spoon-fed, we're about to take off, when in reality, no, the plane's going back to the gate in 3 hours, and you're flying to Tulsa tomorrow.
It's the sunk cost fallacy, man. That's
what is that too?
And yeah, well, but it's that manifest in real life. It's the we use the adaptability attribute, and we make excuses for the inadequacies around us, and hence we don't cut the losses when we should, and we bend over for shit that we should never bend over for. And I like what you said. As you get older, you accept less, because that's sort of what I've found is, everyone talks about, be open-minded and all this sort of stuff.
Be less open-minded. No,
exactly.
Be less open-minded.
I 100% agree with you. As I've gotten older, I've become less open-minded. I've become like, no, this is what I like, and this is what I don't like. And sort of as I think you become older, you also find these principles that make sense. And it's like, well, if it aligns with this principle, great. But I can quickly call bullshit on something if it doesn't align with some first principles. So I love that you sort of brought that up.
I mean,
Um,
what I talk about in the book, Nomad Capitalist, is obviously all about being open-minded. If you get my book, you're not going to get a custom strategy that someone would charge you a five-figure sum to create in an $8 book, right? You're going to get some ideas. You're going to learn about citizenships, about taxes, about this. But a lot of it to me is just about opening your mind. Here's what's possible. Here's what's not possible. Here's some stories. I'm all for being open-minded to things that you're not familiar with. But once you know what you're looking for, I think less open-minded, less opinion-seeking, right? I mean, I think that's an area where people, get confused. But, what I
it's an
found
important
is
nuance.
whatever you're looking for is out there.
Yeah, it's a super important nuance. So I think, talk to me about there's a couple threads I want to pull on here. So maybe I'll start this question this way: is I on a couple of recent Clubhouse rooms that I was running, I was talking about how, Bitcoin as an invention, for example, it changes the base incentives of how society functions, because Bitcoin is fundamentally demonopolized money, and it's voluntary in nature, meaning that if you want to use Bitcoin, you can. If you don't fucking have to, and if you want to change the rules, you kind of opt yourself off Bitcoin. So, again, it's completely voluntary in nature. And I think one of the things you're mentioning earlier is this idea of go where you're treated best, which is the voluntary the voluntary nature of human beings. Like I always say, when I think about first principles and how human beings behave, is, thinking with an Austrian economics hat almost, is when two people trade and they both get a benefit for doing something, that is an additive effect on society. Both increase their wealth, both get a benefit, versus the subtractive version, which is someone stealing something for someone, or someone in the middle leeching, which is effectively what we've got in the manifestation of the state these days. But what ends up happening with both of those is you end up with two very different types of relationships. And this for me is one of the things that I guess early on drove me to not only become a Bitcoiner, but think about, flag theory and everything, which we'll discuss later, which is one relationship, which is what we have with our governments these days, is what I call the subject overlord relationship. Is that you're a subject with very little choices. You basically have 50, 60, 70, 80% of your wealth taken from you. You get told what to do, and then you get slapped in the face if you have a different opinion. Versus the relationship you're kind of talking about, which is this idea of a customer and service provider relationship, which is, what the free market is. If you want to buy something, you go ahead and buy it. If you don't like it, you go somewhere else and you buy something else. You don't have to have that relationship. And you kind of even mentioned that with, you as a business not accepting some customers because you can't help them. So it's your choice. You don't have, there's no volition or requirement on your part to do so. So can we talk a little bit about? Sorry, go on.
I do think that's the missing piece, in all honesty. I mean, as a person who's politically libertarian since, age, whatever, 12, 13, that is the missing piece, is both sides get to choose, right? I mean, the Cayman Islands recently decided, hey, if you want to move here, we're going to nearly double the amount of real estate you need to buy to qualify for a residence permit to live in our tax-free paradise. And they're allowed to do that. Just as, we decide that, if you're obnoxious, or if you I don't know, prove to me, why I should work with you. I choose not to. Thank you. I think it's both sides. I think that let's, as libertarians, realize everyone gets a choice. It's not a one-way street. And so, yes, I think that we should look at business or government as a competitive business. Why is it when you want to go out for Mexican food tonight, you go online and you look at reviews, and if they have much less than 5 stars, you probably aren't going to that Mexican restaurant. But what if the government got a review? What would be the government's review? There are some government agencies that are reviewed. I mean, generally 1 star, 1.4 stars, 1.7 stars, and yet nobody's too concerned. Yeah, I mean, nobody's too concerned about it, right? And we just keep doing the same thing. Why? Well, because there's nowhere that's better. I mean, if you went to a restaurant and you had a bad meal or the server was obnoxious to you, would you be like, well, I guess I can't eat out anymore? No, you'd go to another restaurant, you'd figure it out, And I think people, as you said, they make so many excuses for where it is that they want, where it is that they live. And this, there's these, what I call the patriots, the self-described patriots, people who are going to stay and fight. I just don't understand how that aligns with any other principle where you want competition in life. Yes, we're entering an era where when I was born, you had the United States and you had West Germany and you had a few other countries, right? You weren't going to go to Japan. But since then, in the last 36 years, you have had South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan and Panama. All kinds of countries have emerged. You now look at the freest economies in the world. There are 4 or 5 ex-communist countries that are now more economically free than the United States. You have countries that were part of the Soviet Union that are now some of the easiest places to start a business, some of the safest countries in the world. So times have changed. The era of there's 3 or 4 big countries that are all competing against each other. We've had obviously a lot of countries, have broken up, so you have more competition there. But there's just more countries that have decided, let's put ourselves in the game. Malaysia, let's put ourselves in the global game. Let's attract jobs. Let's attract business. Let's attract investment. And they've all had to be competitive. And I think that's a good thing. So if you're sitting in the United States or if you're sitting in Australia and you're not able to leave, or as I talked to some Canadians yesterday, you're afraid to leave because you think they're going to put you in a hoosgow when you come back. There are places where you can go that are competitive, where they are working on the principles of competitiveness. And if your entire circle is the US, Canada, Australia, UK, you probably don't realize that, but there are countries that are being competitive.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important point, this idea of competition. So, I always try and delineate between, how everything in nature and everything in life functions and gets better through competitive forces. Whether it's, whether you start at natural evolution, natural selection, all the way through to, products and services delivered by human beings, everything is competitive in nature. But somehow we think it's normal that a government, some pack of bureaucrats who are usually the most incompetent group of people, you could imagine in a room, they somehow get to have a monopoly on either the monetary printing press, on the mandates of what is legal and what is not legal. So morality and ethics, and they get a monopoly on shooting you, and violence. It's just crazy how people can't differentiate between those. And I guess having competition on on the scale of where you want to live, I think is really important. But I mean, whilst I agree with you, it is happening in many ways. I think 2020 has proven that despite attempts at being more competitive, like I haven't been too encouraged by too many nation states, like even Eastern European nation states and stuff like that have been a little bit disappointing for me. Like I was in Bulgaria and a couple of the Balkan countries towards the end of last year, and I mean they were better than, for example, how Berlin was approaching mandates. But what's I guess where I'm going with this question is, do you think that the economic reality drives incentives towards the continual breakdown of these older type nation states into more sovereign type jurisdictions that maybe look like Monaco or a Dubai or something like that? And I don't know if you're familiar with Titus Gebel's work, and the guys trying to build private cities. But what's your sort of thoughts in that direction? And how does that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any place is going to be perfect. I think that's what people do
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I live in a place where I've got a lot of problems. I don't have as many freedoms. The social order is turning against me, right? If you look at most Western economies right now, I mean, billionaires shouldn't exist, as if Jeff Bezos was the guy, eating the bat in the market in Wuhan and it's all his fault. Like, no, he just had a business that happened to work with what people in the government decided we should all do, which is be sitting at home, dripping Dorito crumbs on our stained t-shirts. And so now he became even wealthier, and that's an evil thing. It's not an evil thing everywhere. So the social order, the freedom, the taxes. I mean, from my perspective as an entrepreneur, if I can move from one of these big legacy brands where I'm paying 50% in tax to Bulgaria and paying 10% tax, I'm okay. Bulgaria is not my particular cup of tea, but let's just use that as an example. At least I'm putting an extra 40 cents on the dollar in my pocket for the privilege. And now I can figure out where I'm going next. You know what I mean? It's like I work with entrepreneurs who, they make millions of dollars a year. And they say, well, what are you invested in? They said, I haven't had time to figure out investing. I've got $22 million in the bank, right? And you can say, oh, that's so inefficient. But you know what? Better to have $22 million in the bank than not have $22 million in the bank, because eventually they'll get that moment to figure out where they're going to go next with it. So for me, it's about making incremental improvements. And to me, to make as many incremental improvements as possible, you want to cherry pick from the buffet. So where I'm going to personally spend my time is going to be different perhaps than where I'm, paying tax or where I'm, my business is based, because, a place like Singapore, which is fantastic for as a wealth haven, may not be the best place for me to go and live from a cost efficiency standpoint, from a personal freedom standpoint. By the way, I think here's what people don't understand. I'm all for statistics, but when you go and you try and get on the subway in Singapore with a bottle of water, and the rules say you can't drink a bottle of water, there's a guy that's very nice that comes up to just please don't drink the bottle of water. It's not like the TSA or the Border Patrol in the U.S. where some guy who's he's been working out 18 hours a day, and his last job was at Wendy's, barks at you, and he's like the stupidest person you've ever met, but he's just barking orders because that's what it there is a difference. So people say, oh, like Malaysia, they don't like that. I was in Malaysia during the worst of this whole thing, and I can tell you what happened to me there. I felt relative freedom that I don't think I would have had in the United States. Part of that's living in a foreigner area. So part of it is just, I kind of float above society in some ways, because it's not my society. What they do in their own government is not my concern. It doesn't bother me. They don't tax me. They don't hassle me. So I kind of float above it. But I can tell you that from an actual on the ground basis, I mean, I was in Istanbul when they had the big weekend lockdown, and we were walking around as foreigners, and we were allowed to do that. And there were people out selling hot dogs and hamburgers, and you could buy drinks. Like, this is a lockdown. I mean, if a Western country said we're having a great lockdown, you can believe if you went outside to sell a hamburger, you'd have the guillotine on you. So I think there's a difference. And I think it's incremental growth is the point. It's never going to be perfect.
I want to pull further on the thread of private cities, but I think you've kind of touched on a different area that I wanted to discuss, which is there's a thread there about having your business, for example, domiciled somewhere versus having, where you potentially live and everything, which touches on this idea of flag theory. So can you, for the listeners, talk through what flag theory means, and then a couple of the different flags that you think are most important?
Well, I mean, flag theory's been around for decades now. It's the idea that you basically, as I said, cherry pick from the buffet, where you say, all right, where's the best place to incorporate? I'm going to look at that metric, and that's where I'm going to incorporate. Where's the best place to spend time as a person? Where do I like spending time, whether I'm looking to date, or whether I like nightlife, or whether I want, the best restaurants or nature or whatever it is. Like, okay, that's a flag. Maybe it's multiple flags. In my case, I split my time up. Where's the best place to bank? If you still, bank. I mean, I run a business, right? People pay me in fiat currency. So where am I going to bank? That may be different. Where's the passport that I'm going to have? I come from the US. You can be an American, you can live anywhere in the world, you're still going to follow the American rules. So you might want to get a second passport to where you can opt out of that system if you decide. And so, it's the idea of, planting your different flags, going where you're treated best, basically. I think that there's so many options I don't even look at it as, is it 3 flags or 5 flags anymore? I just look at it as, many, many years ago, and I was a young adult and I was new in business, I started looking around the world and I started traveling ever so slowly. And I realized every place had something good to offer. So if I'm a crypto guy, I want to live in a place that's crypto friendly. Number one, because I want to reduce my taxes. And number two, because there's a cultural element where I want to be culturally more in sync with the government, where I'm welcomed rather than repelled, right? There's something about why go where you're repelled? Why be where you're the enemy? Go where you're great, right? And so, if you're bank in a place like Singapore or Switzerland, if you are setting up a company, there's many different places. I think the challenge in the 21st century is what I call the tax-friendly quadrant. So people think, oh, I'll just put my crypto in a company in Belize, or I'll just incorporate my company in Hong Kong, but I'll just stay living here where I'm living. You personally need to move somewhere. You personally need to be in a tax-friendly personal situation. So you need to leave where you're living, and then you need to arrive somewhere where it's friendly. And then your business needs to leave where it is now, and then arrive somewhere it's friendly. So if you're in the US, probably you and your business are in the US, they both need to leave. And maybe you're going to go to Malaysia and the business is going to go to Dubai, right? And so from there, you can choose other flags. I think that there are, dating flags. I think how many people grew up in a country, where they just felt like these people don't get me. Friends, dating, things like that. Lifestyle. What do you want? A big conversation I'm having with folks right now is time zones and weather. They have a business or they're working with folks. They want to be on a right time zone. They want to have a climate. I'm hearing more people get off of let's go to tropical and say, I want 4 seasons. And maybe they're from a place where they don't have 4 seasons, but they, it's all about crafting a life that works for you, keeping more of your money, protecting the money that you have. And I think just being in sync. I mean, for me, it's not just strategic, but there's a human element as well, where it's, are you just in sync? And, I wasn't in sync in the US. I think most successful people really aren't in sync in the US anymore. You're practically a terrorist now if you have money. But I think that's what it's all about.
How dare you be successful, Andrew? How dare you make money? You're killing the babies and the grandmothers. So can you talk to me about the difference between, I know this question, I get hit up a lot with it, so I assume you would probably get an order of magnitude more, but the difference between residency and citizenship, and what the relative benefits of each are.
Well, depends on your current citizenship, right? So if you're an American, remember, if you go and live in a tax-friendly country, you're still going to have to phone home to the US and report your crypto and report your banks and report your income. Now, there's income exemptions. And so I would still rather be an American living overseas and paying 10% of my income in tax rather than 50% of my income in tax, right? But it is a little bit harder as an American. Doesn't mean it's not worth it. But what a residence permit would be is the opportunity to live in a country on a full-time basis, right? So you cannot just go as a tourist and live in Monaco 365 days a year. You need to have a residence permit. The same would go for Dubai or Malaysia or anywhere else. I mean, maybe the exception is Georgia, which has a 360-day visa-free policy for many different countries. You could essentially just live there and come in and out. But where are you going to live? Now that works for a couple of reasons. Number one, you just want to live there, right? I mean, I think that we've seen things like visa runs that people have done where they live in Thailand for 30 days, they leave, they come back, they leave, they come back. It's a hassle when you're successful, but it's also becoming more and more difficult. Countries are kind of cracking down on that. So you have to get a residence permit. What it can also do is, depending on the country, if you live there long enough and if you meet the qualifications, you can be a tax resident. So if you're not an American and you're leaving your country, you need to figure out where it is that you're arriving on paper, right? Now, there are tax residences where maybe you only spend a month a year there, and then you just promise, pinky swear you won't spend more than 6 months in any other country, and now that's your tax base. So residence is where you're living, tax residence is where you're taxed. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they don't, sometimes they help each other, sometimes you split them apart. There's so many different permutations. But, residence could also lead to citizenship. So, if you live in Colombia, for example, for 5 years, you can apply to become a citizen. If you live in Australia, the US, Germany, whatever, a lot of countries allow people to become naturalized citizens. So there may be an opportunity. Again, some countries, you have to live there 1 day a year for X years. Other countries, you've got to live there 9 months a year. So now you've got to start arbitraging. Where do I want to live? What's the tax situation? Am I getting a citizenship? What citizenship is you're a citizen of the country. It's permanent. So it's a greater level of permanence than residence, which I think we've seen in the last year is perhaps more important. You want to choose your citizenships carefully. There are a few Asian countries that are a little bit like mommy states where they kind of tell you what to do and what not to do, where to travel, where to go. So, the US obviously takes a chunk of your money no matter where you live. But if you're a citizen of St. Lucia, as I am, for example, the deal is if you don't live here, we leave you alone. And so citizenship is what gets you a passport, what allows you to travel. And so, citizenship has been important to get for people who are from China or Russia or from the Middle East, where their passports aren't as good and they want travel freedom. And for Americans who wanted to have the option to escape this worldwide regulation, worldwide taxation. But I think now what we're seeing is having multiple citizenships gives you the power to travel when your passport, like the US one, is not respected. As a St. Lucian, I've done that in the last year. So residence is living. Tax residence is where you're taxed. Doesn't mean that you're paying tax, just means that you're subject to tax. It might be zero. And citizenship is where you're a citizen of. You can claim a passport, you can travel. And I think you can put those three together to where they may not be the same place. It may be 2 different places, 3 different places. But hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I think it's an important distinction because when I was a bit younger and first sort of getting in and around this stuff, and I mentioned to you before we jumped on the call, like one of my early inspirations was reading Emergency. And when I was sort of, this was I think during 2011 that I read it, and it wasn't from a citizenship standpoint that I was reading it. I had personally been involved in the GFC, and I initially made a lot of money, then I lost everything, and then I went down the gold and silver path, and somehow stumbled onto this book as I was studying how broken the government system is, and then that was sort of probably my first introduction to some early libertarian thought and things like that, because that kind of thinking is not very, I guess, common in Australia. Right. Australia is a very, very conformist kind of, sheep. The government will take care of you. She'll be right, mate. Kind of thinking. At least, I guess, in America, one thing I will say is that you've got the seeds of libertarianism, are there. Despite. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago saying, one of the central themes of it was America, the state killed America, the dream, so like the American dream was originally one of this idea of, sovereignty of the individual, but it sort of got suffocated out by the institution that became America, the state. But anyway, coming back to what I was talking about is I used to be on this rampage, like, intent on getting as many citizenships as possible. But as you sort of get a little bit more mature here, is you start to understand the nuances between, having a citizenship, and then some citizenships can actually be a fucking detriment to have, like you mentioned, with an American citizenship is like, well, now, hey, guess what? You are caught in the net wherever you are. So, I think I love your use of the word buffet, because that's really what you want to try and set up. Is you want to set up as many options as possible so you can arbitrage across these different dimensions. because then that's what gives you the capacity to choose. I can't remember who said it. It's like, one option is no choice. Two choices is a dilemma. Choice really starts when you have three or more, and I think that's sort of at least what I've tried to do when thinking about how to structure my life is, reside somewhere, tax base, potentially somewhere else, citizenship options, and then try and adjust it. In saying that, it's always easier in theory than it is in practice. But I guess that's the whole point of life, right? It's always easier to talk about things than it is to do them.
Well, that's what sets the winners apart from everyone else, right?
Correct. Exactly. It's got nothing, luck always has a bearing, but at the end of the day, what separates human beings is the fact that one is going to choose to figure the shit out in a practical sense, and the other one is going to choose to just blame someone else or wait till someone else does it for them. So that's that's the difference.
This is the one area where people who seem very empowered and who seem very take charge. I mean, I grew up in the U.S., and you have conservatives and even some libertarians, where I think that the goal is to complain for some people. I mean, I worked in the broadcasting industry for many years. Talk radio is perhaps at least the American version of talk radio is a rather American construct, right? But I was on the business side of working with a lot of bad AM radio stations, running all these talk shows. And, I would go and get invitations to go and meet with these, talk show hosts and see their fan bases and stuff when they had events. I'm convinced 90% of these people would be miserable if they didn't have anything to be miserable about. And they want to talk about empowered and they're business owners and create your own way, but they won't create their own way when, as you said, they're just sitting around waiting. I've had so many folks I've worked with in Australia, and you're right. I mean, I thought the US was bad until I went to Australia. That's like a real nanny state you have, I'll tell you what. And people love it. And it's that whole thing, if you say anything, it's like, oh, excuse me, is there a problem? You're not, there's no one's allowed to have a different opinion. And I mean, people would tell me how if you lived in Adelaide and you wanted to invest in property in Sydney, it was like, wow, you're really going out on a limb. And just this isolation. I think blame geography to start. I mean, the U.S. is pretty isolated because they look down on the Mexicans to the south to their detriment. They kind of, laugh at the Canadians to the north. In Australia, I mean, you're surrounded by nobody. And I think that, if you're in that situation, you need to put in extra effort to kind of go out there and become a bit worldly and see what's available out there. Because I can promise you that when you come into the sphere of countries that I spend time in, the emerging countries, the countries that a lot of people haven't talked about, I mean, it's a whole different world, but you wouldn't even imagine that world exists. It was, if I look back at myself many years ago, it's still hard to kind of comprehend at times. So if I look back at myself, you imagine, oh, it's only things are better. No, things are different, but you have to get in there and understand how it works to be able to use that to your benefit.
Yeah, I think really important point there. It's not about better, it's about different. And then you take the differences and you blend them together to make it better.
And that's my goal, right? I mean, every culture has beautiful things, and but for me, as an entrepreneur and as a Protestant, honestly, from a place in the world, which I think here's another important element. I'm from a part of the world, or from a part of the U.S., where I don't sense, compared to the rest of, we have no pride. There's no pride. I remember I went to Belgium. Okay, Belgium has a lot of problems, but I went there and they're like, we have no patriotism. We don't care about our country. Like, these are my people. You know what I mean? No one's good. I'm a proud Belgian. No, this is what is so detrimental to so many people. You go around the world, the more pride, the less I can promise you. But for me, as an entrepreneur, someone who's always trying to improve things, always trying to improve efficiency, and as a Protestant, I'm always looking to take the best things, but then figure out, all right, how can we improve this? And I think that if you were able to harness the best qualities of many different places, many different things, you can use that. You can create a great life, and you can create a very financially optimized life. You can create a very freedom optimized life. But you have to understand that each element is going to be different.
Yeah. There was, while you were talking about tax residencies earlier, one of the things that also comes up when I'm speaking to different people is the Perpetual Traveler, or I guess PT. I think it's got a couple different definitions. No one really knows which one it is, but can you talk through that, and whether that these days is still a reality? Is it a pipe dream? What it is, and whether it's functional, just because that's one of the questions I got asked.
Perpetual traveler, perpetual tourist, some people say prior taxpayer. It can work. It's the idea that basically you're just a nomadic person. You are not staying in one place for any given, for any long amount of time. And the idea is that countries treat tourists better than they treat their citizens in many cases, right? I mean, you get your sales tax refunded, you get your GST refunded at the airport. As I said, like in Istanbul, we're walking around, oh, you're a foreigner, please, keep on going. I mean, so in many cases, tourists are treated better. Why? Because governments love tourism. And so when people say, well, Andrew goes around and, what's Andrew contributing? Well, we do pay tax. We have a little bit of corporate tax. We pay, a lot of tax for our employees and stuff like that. If I look at, and I spend 3, 4, 5 months in Malaysia, I contribute more in sales tax, buying things as a higher level consumer there than the average person pays in income tax all year, and yet I don't take any of the infrastructure. And then I also take a lot of this money I save in tax and give a lot of money to different charities that actually are efficient, unlike the government. And so, for me, the idea still works of being able to travel around the world, but countries want tourists. So the idea is, like, what if you were just always a tourist, right? What if you were just always the guy that someone wanted to compete for at the country level? Because, it's kind of like, like I remember growing up, my mom was like, after you get married, like the guy stops chasing after you. It's like the thrill of the hunt, some women say. And it's like, once you're a citizen, in some cases, the hunt's over, we got you, or pay up, But as long as you're a tourist, it's like they wine and dine you, or let us show you this, And so the challenge with it is that people are still focused, if you're Australian or Canadian or whatever, on this 183-day rule, where I will spend 5 months in the summer in Australia, and then I'll spend the other 7 months with no home. I mean, today you do need to have a place where you pay tax. If you're from Australia and you're spending a little bit less than 6 months there, that's probably going to be considered your home. So I think what's more difficult now is, if you're from one of these legacy brand countries, you need to be much more clear and much more specific in cutting your ties. That was easy for me because my goal was to spend 0 days in the United States. It made it pretty easy to say, why am I paying you people anything? I'm literally there 0. Right? I'm not using any roads or any bridges. So I think that, if you're from a legacy brand country, number one, you want to get your tax residence set up so you have kind of a cover. And then you want to really make sure that you're limiting your time and your connections to your home country, because they're more aggressive than ever at coming after these folks. Now that we have this whole advent of digital nomads, it's on the radar. That, by the way, is my concern with cryptocurrency. The more it comes on the radar, the more the government will find ways to screw you with it, right? And so now they're saying, oh, there's a lot of people who are becoming nomadic. We can't just let them be here 5 months a year and not pay, and then the other 7 months they're in 7 different countries. Now, if you want to abandon your legacy brand country, either you're Australian and you just say, I don't ever really need to go back, or very little, or you're going to give up your passport and you want to join my world of just being, from countries where they really don't care, then that makes it a lot easier, right? But as long as you're tied to one of these big high tax countries, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Still doable even in this current pandemic era. But, just requires more thought than it did 25 years ago.
Interesting. because we don't have a huge amount of time left, I want to talk to you about 5 to 10 to 20 year sort of outlook across a number of different elements. Because we've seen people have laughed at preppers and people who've been interested in multiple jurisdictions, people who've been interested in Bitcoin. So I personally make a strong delineation between crypto and Bitcoin. Bitcoin for me is the advent of money that has been demonopolized, that is impossible for anybody to co-opt, censorship resistant, etc. So it's the perfect money. Whereas crypto to me is just private digital money printed by fucking clowns who want you to use their money. And I think that is very dangerous because that is sort of within the sphere of government influence, whereas Bitcoin sort of sits outside of that. But I want to talk to you about, what does the 5 to 10 to 20 year outlook for you look like after, I guess, 2020 as a watershed moment for seeing how ridiculous things can get when these so-called traditional free societies, show their colors, because the traditionally free societies have benefited from the production of capital by free individuals for such a long time that they have enough resources to turn into basically our captors, our jailers. So what's your thoughts? What does the world look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, across the government dimension, the taxation dimension, maybe the emergence of free private cities, travel, all this sort of stuff? Let's have a discussion about that.
I've supported. I'm friends with the folks at Liberland, and I find these kind of libertarian initiatives very interesting. I think as a pragmatist, as an entrepreneur, being a citizen of Liberland is not going to help me with my taxes. It's not going to help me be any more free. I can't go and live in Liberland. I can't go and live on a cube in the ocean. So I don't know exactly how that's going to go. I think that I would generally trade a little bit of vision for pragmatism in the moment, because I think the moment's all we have. But I think that what you're going to see, I'm a big believer in momentum. And you have especially countries like the US and Australia, which are the Louis Vuitton of countries, the Gucci of countries. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. I like to buy nice shoes. But if you don't realize you're overpaying for it, for a brand, then you're going to be in for a rude awakening. And the momentum in those countries, as I said, for 25 years has been against the individual, against success. I remember I got upset by an article in the newspaper criticizing my advanced studies program in 6th grade or 5th grade. And my dad said, yeah, get used to it. This is what success looks like in life. Everyone has a gripe with you. And it's basically become the national motto of most Western countries now. If you're successful, you're the enemy. I think it's only going to get worse. It's going to manifest itself in wealth taxes. It's going to manifest itself possibly for crypto investors in some kind of unrealized capital gains tax. I think you're going to have to make a choice between being much more transparent about your finances or becoming a criminal. I don't want to live in a place where I'm going to be a criminal. They call me the goody two shoes of the offshore world. I don't want to be lying on forms. I don't want to be doing that. I'd rather just opt out. And so I think that it's going to be more taxes. I think it's going to be more restrictions. I don't know. I mean, who knows? If you would have said 8 years ago, Edward Snowden, about what he was doing, nobody, most people wouldn't believe that. So I don't even know. I don't even want to guess what will happen in 10 years. But here's what I will guess. There's always going to be somebody who wants to be competitive. I don't believe in this defeatist, the Great Reset. I mean, there's certainly some conspiracy theories out there. If you look at the nature of countries, we're in a multi-generational cycle where you have the legacy brands, the Western countries that were built on success. They're too far distanced from what made them successful now. So now they're going to go out like a trust fund kid and ruin it. And yet you have countries that have come out of a cycle at a different period where they've seen the consequences of doing that. And they're going to be much more resistant to making the same mistakes. Now, 50 years from now, is the cycle going to reverse and Australia will be the best place on earth and a beacon of freedom once again? maybe, and I think you have to be open to that. But I think being adaptive is the most important thing. What I've said is better a couple years too early than a day too late. So from my perspective, I'm not tethered to any Western country. I do not need the Five Eyes countries in my life. I don't miss them. I am part of countries that are emerging and growing and that are the future. And I think that might be a decision people need to make at some point. I think other countries are going to impose taxation the way the US does to some level. People laughed at me as an American, all my German friends and Australian friends. Oh, it's so funny. Yeah, you're next. Because you can see, I mean, it's been talked about in Canada and Australia and France. Not all of them will do it, but you'll have more people as the culture becomes entitlement minded. How come you get to be Canadian also and not pay? Well, I thought I was paying for the schools and the roads and the bridges, and that's like what we should pay for, right? And they'll just flip it and use it whenever it's to their advantage in both directions. And you'll have to make a decision, I think. I think there's going to come a time, much like your ancestors left wherever they were from to go to wherever they are now. You'll have to make a choice. Is this a place that I want to be in anymore? I had ancestors who left Norway, Lithuania, Wales, and they went somewhere new and they left it behind. I had a grandfather who left Czechoslovakia during the war, after the war, and could never go back. And I think that, some of those choices may have to be made in the future for financial reasons, for freedom reasons, because I think that, again, legacy brands, like any business that thinks it has a monopoly, are going to start making more and more demands of you. And you're going to have to either become a criminal or opt out.
Yeah, I think to wrap this up, I think a theme that seems to come up with all sorts of different guests that I have on the show is this idea of the seasonality of existence, which you kind of mentioned is, I'm sure you've heard of the saying of like, strong men create good times create weak men create bad times, bad times, recreate strong men. And I really think that, what a lot of the world is in, particularly the more affluent places, are sort of in the third innings where, the weak men have created bad times. And those bad times, I don't know where we are along that, but sort of we got a glimpse of it in, in 2020 is how really dumb things can get. And, like I've got a lot of friends in Canada now, and some of the things I'm seeing there are just absolutely wild. It's like, their finance minister saying that, like trying to come after people's savings and stuff. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible to, It's like, so I think, you said another word, which for me, like I have for many years have said, because I've always been an entrepreneur. Like I've never had a paycheck. Like I've always had to do things myself. And for me, I think the root of all evil is entitlement. I don't see anything worse than entitlement in any sort of behavior. Like the idea that you can covet or have a say on something that you didn't earn, for me, is categorically the ugliest characteristic of anything.
And that is fundamentally the issue, right? Is that, like, again, no pride, but also no entitlement for me. I mean, if I spend, even today, everything's going well, been in business many years, like yourself, always been in business. But if I take a couple hours off on a Sunday, to this day, I can hear like someone in my family's voice in my head, like, you think you're entitled to any relaxation? I can't. And yet you look at, in the US, you look at Australia, what's the definition of a strong man or a weak man, right? I'm sitting here to this day, and I'm working my face off. Like you, I'm sure, we deal with all the nonsense that comes from being, from putting out content publicly. And to me, there's a strength in that, but not in the US, because if you wear a scarf, you're weak. I mean, literally, like there must have been, I asked Taco to go through and count, who runs our YouTube. At one point, there were like 300 comments who said, like, don't listen to this guy. He's wearing a sweater. That's a weak man in the West. If you wear a sweater now, it's not about what you've built. It's not, it's everything's been turned on its head.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything's upside down. Like health is apparently stay inside, watch Netflix, stay out of the sun, and get a vaccine. Whereas it's unhealthy to go out, get fresh air, exercise, and be with people. Like the whole fucking world's upside down at the moment. It's really, but yeah, I think a lot of that is perpetuated through these monkeys that have grown up fundamentally entitled and thinking they have the capacity to dictate what other people can and cannot do with what they've earned, and that for me is the most abhorrent thing that exists, and it is the cancer that continues to come in and decay society.
Here's the other thing. You know, like I think people who are entrepreneur, who are successful people, you know, you don't become a winner by wanting everyone else to lose. And so you look, I'll make like the dating analogy. You know, if you are good at dating and you get along and you have women who are interested in you, you don't have this chip on your shoulder where you can just go and say, you know what, I'm in the mood to go to a nice restaurant. Let's come along. And if she wants to be, you know, jerk about it, great. All right, next. But, you know, when you have the woman who's like, all right, let me send you my demand list before we meet, you're like, that's a step too far. Perhaps if these countries, you know, said the tax rate's 9%, you know, maybe you tolerate that, maybe you don't. Now we can argue libertarianism and is it fair? But you know what? They've become too greedy. It's give us half of your wealth, and then if you keep money in the bank, you know, we want to take some of it one day, we will, and maybe your retirement account is next, and then they pass taxes and they say, oh, did we pass that in November? We meant to pass it in January, so just go back to January and pay it from then. So you have nowhere to hide. You know, it becomes so greedy. It's like the woman who it's like sends you the list of 50 things and like, I'm not going out unless they have like, you know, oysters on the menu. And it's like, you know what? You've taken a step too far. Now I'm out. And perhaps if they just weren't so greedy about it, you would tolerate it, and you would just be the person who did tolerate a little bit of nonsense. But they take it so far.
Well, the problem is because they're in a bind. So that's the thing. It's like that they actually not only are they arrogant and ignorant enough to think that they just can, because they think that you know, they are some sort of they exist to ensure that you and I can live, because apparently you and I are too incompetent to make decisions on our own. So not only do they come from that paradigm of believing that without their magical fucking existence that the rest of us human beings can't interact, but their very existence necessitates the growth of their parasitic nature, because they need to, you know, somehow validate their existence. So in doing so, they need to say, oh, look at what we're doing. You know, without us, you wouldn't have this. Without us, you wouldn't have that. So then they take more money, they squander more of it. They don't realize why they've squandered it. So they're like, oh, well, fuck, we need to prove that we're doing something here. So let's just take more. So this is the sort of the non-conspiratorial view of the incompetence of the state. And as to why it continues to get more and more and more and more greedy is because they are running a bankrupt enterprise. You know, like if they were a business, they would have been bankrupt years ago. But the difference is that unlike you and I, who have a consequence of running a poor business, they just print more and, you know, control P, or control fucking T, which is let's just take a little bit more out of these idiots that were imprisoning.
I will say this. I'm a big believer in the small country. Number one, they can turn on a dime. I mean, if you look at the transformation the country like Georgia made, I'm having an event, the former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, he's certainly a controversial figure these days, but he turned the country from a Soviet backwater into the sixth easiest place to start a business very quickly. You couldn't do that in a country the size of the US. I was even talking to folks in New Zealand. I mean, they let this thing of democracy. I'm okay, Georgia's democracy, but, you know, they can't build a bridge in 10 years. China wants to build a bridge. They snap their fingers. It's done in 6 months now. Do we teach China the answer? Not necessarily. But what I will say is, speaking of quotes, I saw something the other day. A guy said, I'm an anarchist on a global level. a libertarian at the federal level. I'm butchering it also.
It's a Taleb quote. It's a Taleb quote. So I'm
Yeah,
libertarian at the
Taleb, you're
federal
right.
level. I'm libertarian at the federal level. I'm a Republican at the state level. I'm a socialist at the city level,
The
and I'm
local,
a communist at the local level. Yeah.
right, right. I mean, so I mean, when I left the U.S. and I had an empty room in my house that I wanted to fill, my parents are like, "Why don't you just let your sister move there?" It's like, I didn't think we were communists, but you're right. At a local level, you help you help your family out, and if you know the person in the school district and she's Judy, you probably give her a lot more leeway. If you look at like St. Lucia, for example, you make a donation, you become a citizen. It's the biggest of the 5 islands that do that. They have 180,000 people, and you look at how that money is spent. Now, of course, there's always some opposition politician complaining, but they've got to spend it with a good deal of accountability. They can't just be like, I don't know, the Pentagon lost $6 billion. Where did it go? We have no idea. I mean, like $6 billion, they lose $6 million, they're screwed. So I do think that when you're in these smaller countries, not only can they turn on a dime faster, but there is some level, it's not perfect, but it's a greater level of accountability than you get in the US, where 20% of people work for some government body, and hey, you can't complain to us. And it's also that thing, it's that corporate bureaucracy we started out at, where it's like, hey, why was my flight canceled? Don't ask me. I'm not in charge of canceling flights.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Someone
you
else's
do
fault.
work.
Yeah.
But you do work for the airline. So unless you want to put me in touch with that person, how about like we're having a conversation? So I think that you have less of that in a small country. Not perfect, but better.
You absolutely do. Well, this is the reality of scale. So governance does not scale, and this sort of goes down another philosophical rabbit hole. But this is why I think like sort of these pushes for whether it's global government or large scale government, they will never ever work, because human beings are fundamentally diverse. We're different, and governance cannot scale to large degrees, because you can't fit everybody in the same box, and you can't create a functional level of accountability at a large scale. It's just fucking impossible. So what you have to do in order for human beings to function well together is you have to break it down into locales. Locales function very well. Like, when you know somebody and you know what they did, there is a level of skin in the game that creates accountability naturally. But when you have the state, which is, America, that, governs apparently 300 million people, who the fuck are you going to keep accountable? Like you said, so it's impossible to do that. And that's where scale is such an important thing. And that's actually why I believe, so, my whole thesis on, Bitcoin bankrupting large scale government is through, Bitcoin's economic gravity and sucking money out of the system. What ends up happening is large scale governments end up going bankrupt, and we start to move towards fragmentation and localization, where we get to where I kind of opened the conversation. We move away from the subject overlord relationship to the customer service provider relationship, and that happens as an economic necessity and as an economic reality when the large scale state can't print itself out of trouble and can't tax the fucking citizenry to death. So if we can remove that by pulling the monopoly of money outside of anybody, we actually force nation states to break down. And I think the ones who are already small, the ones who are already nimble, they've got a huge advantage in the coming decades, because they're already that size. But the behemoths that want to sort of cling on to the old ways, cling on to their fucking brand, as you like to put it, cling on to the money printer, and cling on to like an ever increasingly worthless monetary unit or an economic unit, they're the ones who are going to be in the biggest shit. And that's that would be my sort of outlook.
I think you're going to go down with them, right? I mean, I think you don't recover. If you're an alcoholic, you've got to admit you're an alcoholic, and you've got to hit rock bottom first. I've known people who were alcoholics, and it's an unpleasant ride getting to that rock bottom. And I don't think you've hit rock bottom yet in these Western countries. So you can stick around, but you're going to be like the guy clinging to the leg of the alcoholic who's slowly, on his way to homelessness. I don't want to be there for that.
It reminds me of the early days, like, because I've sort of studied World War II quite a bit, and it reminds me of the early days of how, the rationalization that Jewish people made in Germany when all of the shit was really starting to go wrong. Even in the beginning, like sort of the Jewish communities were like, no, it'll be okay. We can just stay and all this sort of stuff. So it's like, it actually ties perfectly to what we were discussing in the beginning, is that adaptability of human beings is that we will learn to accept shit when we shouldn't, when, we don't draw the line when we should, based on shit that we know. And it, like you said, it's unfortunate because they're the people that end up going down with the shit. But in many ways, it's, I guess, as harsh as this sounds, every action and every decision we make has a consequence. And, perhaps for some people who choose not to take action and make a change, the consequence is going down with the shit.
And in closing, I mean, I think there's a little bit of prescience needed here, where, this is for many people an insurance policy. I think it's becoming less and less so by the day. I think it's becoming more of a plan A and less of a plan B by the day. But still a lot of people coming and saying, I want a plan B. But here's the thing with the plan B. It's not, and I just had a gentleman yesterday, he's paid $3 million in the last 6 months alone, or will pay $3 million on cryptocurrency trading. He's got an immediate issue that has a very fast ROI. I mean, what does it cost to go and do this stuff properly? A heck of a lot less than $3 million. I mean, he's going to get an ROI in days, weeks. But if the idea is, I want to have a place where I can go that's safe, I want to have options, as you're saying, it's like buying car insurance. No one likes to buy car insurance. We like to know that if you're Tiger Woods and you drive your car, I don't know what's even going on with Tiger Woods, but you want to make sure you're covered. But no one likes paying for car insurance for 10 years and never having a claim. But that's what it is. And so when someone comes to me and says, I've got $10 million in crypto, I say, yeah, you want to insure yourself with something. It's going to cost money. There's not going to be an ROI right away. But later, when the time comes and some new law is about to be passed, you'll have an option in your back pocket that you can execute on immediately. And that's worth having. It's never easy to say, hey, I'm going to stroke a check for $100,000 to St. Lucia. But I think you'll generally look back and say, hey, business kept going, money kept coming in. It was a good investment to make sure I was covered.
Yeah, I think the time to be prepared is when you don't need it, because when you need it, it's often too late. And so yeah, I think that's not only prescient but poignant.
If you've got one, if the U.S. exit tax kicks in when you have a $2 million net worth and you've got $1.92 million in Bitcoin, it's too late to call me and try and get your second passport 5 or 6 months from now. Unless you think the market's going to be flat for the next 5 or 6 months. I mean, you're too late. I mean, you need to plan ahead. And, I think that's, to me, it's very entrepreneurial, right? It's sacrificing now to win later. It's seeing where the puck is going and following it and making sure that you're ready. So.
Yeah, I would push back on the Bitcoin piece, though. I think Bitcoin has the uniqueness of being confiscatable. Now, I know that as a government, they could do things to you. Like me and Godfrey Bloom had a discussion about this, and he's like, yeah, well, they can just throw you in a fucking room and all that sort of stuff. But I think the fact that I forgot my private key, is something that is powerful enough with Bitcoin. Like it is, by making private property easy to defend and extremely difficult to attack. It makes the capacity for implementing a wealth tax on that specific asset very, 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 very difficult. And that's something no other asset on the planet shares. No fucking crypto, none of these things. So I think Bitcoin kind of transcends a lot of that. But in saying that, most people don't hold their own keys. Most people don't, hold Bitcoin with the best sort of, how can I say, best practices when it comes to privacy. So they're quite public about, their holdings and all that sort of stuff. So it's having all these things, I guess it's like security in any sense. There is no silver bullet. There is only lead bullets. I call it lead bullet strategy, which is, you're better off having best practice. Like, first of all, you're best off holding your wealth in something like Bitcoin, which cannot be confiscated. But then you're better off holding it with the best, where you hold your own keys. Then you're better off, having good privacy hygiene. You don't sort of walk around with your fucking wallet open, down the street, right? So you want to keep that. But then you also need to know that you need a jurisdictional backup plan. You need to go somewhere just in case, a lunatic like Biden or whoever wants to introduce unrealized capital gains, which they might be able to tie back to you in some way, shape, or form. So I think this is the thing. It's like all of these plan Bs, all of these prepping ideas are becoming more and more of a necessity than they are a luxury. And that accelerates as things get worse. And again, like I always question people, do you think, based on what you've seen in the last 12 months, that the clown show is going to get better or it's going to get worse? I don't think anyone can tell me with a fucking straight face that things are all of a sudden going to get better with the same idiots running it. Like, it just doesn't happen that way. So I think, if there's one message from this that, I'm hearing not only from you, but that I'm hoping that the listeners hear, is that preparation is important, and doing something to create a backup now, which is increasingly looking less like a backup, is prudent and entrepreneurial, I guess, in nature. So yeah,
very important stuff.
Sweet, Andrew. Is there anything else you want to quickly add to this, or do you want to mention where people can find you, your work, so that they can follow what you're doing?
Yeah, so this is, if you're watching, this is the book. It's on Amazon. It's called Nomad Capitalist. And as I said, it's a great introduction. I don't know that it's going to create your entire 13-point or 17-point plan that I would do with somebody, but it's a good place to start. Got over 1,100 free videos on YouTube. Got over, or close to 2,000 articles on nomadcapitalist.com. And we have a boutique firm that helps people do this stuff, I think, with a great level of not only strategy, holistic strategy that covers all the jurisdictions, but also a human strategy. To me, that as you're talking, it comes down to, where am I just going to go and feel best? Why do I want to stay under Biden or under Trump, whoever, and just be miserable and just worry? I think there's a great freedom in just in taking a very human approach to this. So nomadcapitalist.com is the website. Nomad Capitalist is the book, the YouTube channel, lots of resources out there.
Easy. Awesome. All right, Andrew. Look, this was a really great chat. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And I'm sure the listeners, the viewers, they're going to get a lot of value out of this, man. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.